7:37, Nashville's Morning News on Super Talk 99.7 WTN. Welcome on in. Your Thursday, August 8th, along with Johnny B, Ken Weaver, Dan Mandis here. So much to catch up with EJ Haust, who joined us yesterday at the exact same time, I believe. And Aaron, there's so much that we were trying to get with you to talk about all of the issues with Governor Tim Walz from Minnesota. You are a former, is it Minnesotan? Is that what they say? Minnesotans?
That is what they say, Minnesotan.
All right, very good. And you lived there for 12 years. And we're talking about the perils of Tim Walz, not only as a congressman, but also as a governor. And I think we left off with and the reason I wanted to have you back 2 days in a row is just because there's so much to talk about. And I think one of the things that we ended with yesterday, we didn't have enough time to get to, was the COVID lockdowns. And I think that for many Americans, we all understand that some states, and we're just talking about this in one of the previous segments, some states opened up sooner than others. Some states had lockdowns that were more onerous than others. And one of the big issues that a lot of people who have fled Minnesota, and you're one of them who you fled Minnesota, you moved here to Tennessee, and one of the things that people are saying is that the loss of freedoms during COVID.
Yes, absolutely. It was a really strange time. It was neighbor pitted against neighbor, and I recall sitting in my living room. Every day, there was a time where he would give these reports every day. He would give these press conferences, if you will. And he would come out like this overlord and give us the rules of the day, the things we were allowed to do, the things we weren't allowed to do. And everyone kind of watched or listened on the radio, like, what is he going to tell us today? And I kept thinking how dystopian that was. It's a very strange thing to have lived under that. And when I tell friends here in Tennessee what it was like, it's almost as if they don't believe me because it was awful. I recall some of the things that were just so terrible, even while other states were opening. Remember, Minnesota was one of the last to kind of come back into the reality of life, right? And I recall sitting in my living room with a girlfriend, and she said what she was going through with her father. Her father was in a long-term care facility, and she and her two siblings were not allowed to see her dying father at the same time. They were told the rules from the governor, the rules from the Minnesota Department of Health were that you could only have one person who was allowed to, not one person at all, one person at a time, but rather one person at all. So imagine sitting there with your siblings and deciding who gets to see your dying father. Yeah. And they were told, oh, well, you can talk to them through the windows. Not everyone's that. Some of these long-term care facilities have multiple floors, but we would listen every single day to find out what we were allowed to do.
That is insanity. And I think for people who are listening, and you're right, EJ, when you talk about how people may not actually be able to relate to how onerous some of these restrictions were in other states like Minnesota, because we had our restrictions here, but they were really bad, really, really bad in the liberal states like Minnesota. And it took them longer, as you noted, to open back up. I do want to, I think we touched on this very briefly. This was, Johnny needs some audio. This was Governor Walz the other night.
In Minnesota, we respect our neighbors and their personal choices that they make. Even if we wouldn't make the same choice for ourselves, there's a golden rule. Mind your own damn business.
Right. A lot of people finding that comment ironic, of course, because of the COVID snitch line in Minneapolis and Minnesota.
You could call a snitch line. They set up this like one Minnesota line, and you could say, oh, well, my neighbor has some friends over, or the kids are playing basketball out in the driveway and they have more than 6 people. It was outrageous. And again, remember, this was at a time where other states were opening. It was also at a time, let's not forget, where there were carjackings, there was violent crime, there was riots in the streets, there were protests on the regular. Nobody was getting in trouble for meeting in mass numbers down in Minneapolis. But, God forbid you should have a few people gather for coffee or sit around a fire pit in the backyard. The other thing I will say, too, is Walz, very much like some of the other governors that you heard about that were, kind of out, Newsom going to a restaurant and Pritzker going on vacation or his family going on vacation, those kinds of things. Governor Walz attended, and I know this for a fact, I saw it with my own eyes. Governor Walz attended a very large gathering of about 200 people for a memorial service in a tent. So one of those large kind of event tents, right, with the four sides and all of that. So essentially indoors. He was indoors at a funeral or a memorial service for a big-time Democrat donor. And this was while the rest of us weren't allowed to basically leave our homes.
It's like a Gavin Newsom moment.
Yes. Yep. And it's got no attention. I tried desperately to get it out there. I certainly talked about it on radio in Minnesota locally. But, news in Minnesota just is not interested in actually covering what's going on.
Real quickly, I want to get to China, and I want to get to, and we're going to cover the fraud first. Talk about the $250 million COVID-era fraud schemes that clearly Governor Walz in Minnesota was not watching, and the $250 million. What happened there? I mean, I've read about it, and it looks like it was his Department of Education that was supposed to be watching these funds, and they just disappeared.
It's wild, isn't it? So the Department of Education, yes, under Walz, and remember, this was something he wanted. He loved the attention, and really, he was such an opportunist. He thought, all right, we're going to use this COVID money. We're going to feed everybody, and even now, one of his big things is everybody gets school lunch and breakfast in Minnesota, right? He's very proud of that, and he wants that to be a central thing that people remember about him. What I want our media friends to ask is what happened to that $250 million? So there's a lawsuit. It gets very strange. We know that the money was used for luxury car purchases and homes and vacations, all kinds of things by the criminals involved in that particular program. It's called Feeding Our Future. But it gets even more bizarre. The jury was bribed by people who were involved in the lawsuit. So now it's turned into this even bigger scandal because not only can they not take their lumps, but they had to go and bribe the jury. And so there's another whole component of this. It's like an octopus with all its tentacles. It's not as hey, some money was lost. It's a huge scandal.
It's a huge scandal and very complicated as well. I tweeted out the one of the stories on it. There's a lot of stories out there on the fraud in Minnesota during COVID era. I want to play you an audio bite of Governor Walz and what he says about China.
And I lived in China, and as I said, I've been there about 30 times, but if someone tells you they're an expert on China, they're probably not telling you the truth because it's a complex country. But it's critically important for us. I don't fall into the category that China necessarily needs to be an adversarial relationship. I totally disagree.
Kind of weird, knowing what we know about China, stealing our intellectual property, China smuggling fentanyl and drugs along with Mexico over our southern border, trying to influence and interfere with our elections and so forth. It just seems a rather bizarre comment for this guy to make.
I agree. And, it's not real easy to just bebop over to China anytime you want, 30 plus times, right? There's some pretty intense paperwork, work visas and things like that, particularly with students. So it started in 1989 when he was working with a Harvard University volunteer program. He did not go to Harvard University, but he was part of this volunteer program. And he was supposed to be teaching like American history or global history in English, something like that. And he would take students over there. So it was a job. But what's interesting about that is it's not real easy. You have to be very well connected to have a business that operates in China, right? Like, how does just this guy from Chadron College, from Nebraska, this folksy, guy who always wears a flannel, how does he get the kind of clearance and appreciation from the Chinese government that he can come back and forth 30 plus times? It's very bizarre. There's also a report going around, a video circulating, where he says that free speech is not guaranteed, that so-called hate speech or misinformation is not permitted. No, sir. That sounds really Chinesey. You know, in America, speech is protected. It's a natural right. I think we have to have some real reporters, some people who really want to know, investigate and find out, ask Walz to his face how he feels about China's policies, because it clearly seems to influence his philosophies on America and American politics and certainly American government and what kind of roles and responsibilities that people in power have. And no one's really asking him that, you know, and it can't just be us attacking him and saying, you know, he's bizarre, he's weird, this doesn't make any sense. We need somebody to ask him to his face, what are his philosophies? What are the influences that China had on him? Remember, he was married on the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. This is a guy who loves China.
That is so bizarre.
There.
Well, and EJ, here's that audio bite you were referring to.
I think we need to push back on this. There's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy.
So one thing that I would say is, okay, then, Governor, what are you saying is misinformation? Because, and not that it matters, but I mean, they were saying that the laptop from hell was misinformation for, I mean, at least a year. And then a couple of years after the election. So, yeah, is the government, are they the ones that are going to be telling us what we're allowed to say because they're going to tell us what we're saying is misinformation? When it turns out, as EJ, you know, many things that talk show hosts like you and I have said over the years, we've been accused of spreading misinformation. It turned out what we were saying was true. EJ, let me talk real quick, because I know that you've worked in journalism, you've worked as a talk show host and so forth. You've mentioned the journalists in Minnesota. By and large, I mean, what is your opinion about the media and their clear hands-off coverage of Kamala Harris and the fact that J.D. Vance is now calling out, not Kamala Harris, because you expect her not to answer questions, but J.D. Vance, I think, is being really smart now and ratcheting up the pressure on the media to hold them accountable?
I think it's interesting that for any GOP candidate, but particularly Trump and Vance, they have to create this earned media, this pay attention to me. I believe Trump is going to give some sort of a speech or a news conference today, and everyone will cover it. But try and get them to show up to, you know, a regular rally or, you know, cover him favorably or anything like that. It's very strange. I don't think our media wants to lose their access. And I've felt this way for a lot of years. It is trickling down all the way to the local level also, where in Minnesota, for example, you know, Tim Walz got a lot of positive coverage. They just love him and his crazy lieutenant governor. They don't want to lose their access. So make no mistake, like, this is all part of the machine. And I don't know if you've heard Vivek Ramaswamy talk about, you know, we're not competing against a person or a couple of people. We're actually competing against a machine. We're fighting for our freedoms against a larger cabal, right, of people who really enjoy that power. And the media can be put in that category also. You know, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to put, you know, and this misinformation stuff out there to understand that the media has a very strong hold on the psyche of America, and whether it's coordinated or it just happens to be groupthink. Either way, it's very dangerous. Well,
you want to talk about the cabal. I mean, you could talk about the media. Obviously, the Democrats. You've got those high dollar donor type people like George Soros. You've got all the agencies as well, of course. Hollywood. I mean, you're right. There's a lot of people that like to be the kingmakers, and it's those same people that became really angry when Hillary lost in 2016 to Donald Trump. He was not their preferred candidate. And so now I believe that they are still trying to exact their revenge. EJ, how can people find you on Twitter?
Great question. Please go to X and follow. You can probably find me, capital E, capital J. I have a little heart next to my name and a blue check mark. But you can also find me at Erin Haust, ERINHAUST.